Wonderful. Manon, I can also see you behind us. I hope you can hear as
Yes,
well. It's fantastic to have you
definitely.
with us. And overall, I'm very excited to be joined by a group of veterans of the field for this discussion on United in Cyber Attribution. Attribution has been at the heart of cyber conflict, debates from the very beginning. And as such, these discussions, of course, have seen significant shifts and evolutions from attributing states, seeing their credibility being called into question because the possibility of attribution at some point was called into question itself, to now states seeing their credibility being questioned because supposedly they are not attributing fast enough or not consistently enough, or do so in isolation without support from international partners. The war in Ukraine has only raised the stakes further, with Ukrainian officials collecting evidence of cyber operations that are linked to conventional military attacks and are sharing this information with the International Criminal Court in The Hague. A constant throughout this has been the balancing act of calling out threat actors and raising awareness about their activity on the one hand, and then the risking of sources and methods this involves to make the discovery possible in the first place. And this is joined by operational adjustments that threat actors might pursue in response to their tactics and techniques being disclosed, which complicates the tracking of their undertakings going forward. What this raises is the question of what the desired strategic impact of attribution on the behavior of threat actors and their sponsors should look like, so that it can outweigh these operational changes, so that the disclosure of insights into the attack techniques and tactics does not result in a net loss of security. With that in mind, I would like to start into our conversation with a philosophic sounding question, but don't worry, I'm not going to ask you about the meaning of life. I'd rather like you to unpack for us what is the purpose of attribution. The title of our session implies that part of this teleology is accountability. Patrick, if I could ask you to take us into this conversation, is accountability the North Star of public attribution?
Thank you, Jakob, and good morning, everyone. I'm happy to kick it off with the philosophical question that you said. You know, what is the purpose of attribution, and do we really need to attribute to have accountability? But also maybe ask a broader question, what is accountability and how do we generally define it? For those following the conversations in the international domain, and as you have presented it in the relations on state to state, the question of attribution has been primarily linked exactly as this necessary condition in order to end impunity. And by ending impunity, we mean imposing consequences or calling out the behavior that is contradictory to the international law or the existing norms of state behavior as agreed, for instance, at the United Nations. But as we have seen, that has not necessarily worked, right? So the mere fact that we attribute doesn't necessarily really lead to more accountability, but at the same time, another function of attribution that has been very often called is the fact that you can sort of deter the malicious behavior of the actors by attributing to them, by naming and shaming them, and in that way sort of reduce the number of the malicious attacks in cyberspace. Again, the attribution as a sort of signaling strategy to some extent has also failed. This deterrence function has failed. So the idea has evolved over years, and I think now we are reaching the stage where the conversation is getting a bit more mature, and we ask exactly the questions. Why do we want to attribute? What is the link with accountability? And when we talk about accountability, I think there's one thing I would like to make clear. States love to talk about accountability. They would love to hold other states and actors accountable, but they would not necessarily like to be held accountable themselves. And I think that is something that we really have to acknowledge. The European Union loves to talk about holding other actors accountable, but does not necessarily have standards of accountability for its own members, or does not have the mechanisms under which the EU member states would be held accountable, right? The conversation about cyber sanctions years ago was clearly formulated by excluding any potential accountability of individual member states. So I think we have to also acknowledge the fact that when we talk about attribution and accountability, we usually like to think of it as something that applies to others rather than to ourselves. And that is sort of linked to the fact that many of the standards that have been accepted and developed at the UN level are also of a voluntary nature. So if we ask about, is attribution needed for accountability? Not necessarily. Now, there are two related questions, and I'll wrap up there, that I think we should be answering. And thinking about accountability, the first one should be, of course, who is accountable, to whom, and for what. That needs to be very clearly defined. But the second related set of questions is even more important, and that's something that has really made the conversation within the international circles much more complicated. So according to what standards are we going to be to hold other actors accountable? Who is defining those standards? And so far we have seen that we've been the ones in the driving seat, but that's not necessarily the case if we look forward. Now, if we set the standard, who is it going to be monitored by? Who is going to be this actor or group of actors who will be responsible for monitoring the behavior and how compliant it is with the standard that has been defined? On the basis of what information is that in monitoring to be held? You know, we know that states are very protective of the information they have and do not necessarily like to share the information they have at their disposal. So how are we going to conduct this monitoring? And finally, the issue of sanctions, that seems to be really the most important for anybody talking about accountability. There is almost this immediate connection of accountability failing if the sanctions cannot be imposed, but even more importantly, if they cannot be executed. So does an actor need to be punished, and in what way, in order to be held accountable, I think is something that that the international community is struggling with. And I'm happy to unpack the issue of sanctions in the literal and less literal meeting later on, but hopefully this already kicks us off. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you, Patrick, also for highlighting that accountability is a two-way street. It's not only about holding threat actors accountable, but also making sure that the attribution process itself is following due process norms. Manon, if I could pull on the thread that Patrick has been spinning on ending impunity, could you speak to us about the relationship between attribution and the EU's cyber diplomacy toolbox?
Thanks, Jakub, and thanks for having me. And always nice to be on a panel with Patrick because you're sure that controversial topics will be brought to the table. One thing I do really agree with what Patrick says is that indeed attribution is not needed for accountability, and that's something that the EU actually over years has been promoting, that attribution is a tool, is not a means, is a means to an end, but is not a strategy in and of itself, because that tool or the attribution as such could contribute to accountability in cyberspace, but it's not necessarily a one-on-one relationship. It's a practice of assigning a responsibility. But the main objective here is how we can enhance peace and security in cyberspace, where attribution there can play a part. And indeed, accountability is there to end the impunity, and our cyber diplomacy toolbox is there to contribute to that. Maybe there what we have done since the establishment of the Cyber Diplomacy Toolbox in 2017 is fairly, in all honesty, say, sometimes at an ad hoc basis, try to point out malicious cyber activities with or without attribution, direct attribution, or sometimes attributing to individuals and entities when it came to cyber sanctions, but with a broader objective, indeed, to enhance this peace and security, but also to see if those measures could influence the behavior of malicious actors, could deter them and discourage them from taking further action, to raise awareness on malicious cyber activities as such, and therefore also enable mitigation measures. But also to promote the UN framework of responsible state behavior and to establish this norm that has been agreed in the UNGGE and endorsed by the UN General Assembly, to then basically point out that that behavior, which is shown in the public domain, does not adhere to this framework. And by attribution, you can actually strengthen that message and give it more prominence. So it's really a full package of what you can do with the cyber diplomacy toolbox as such, where attribution can basically enforce those measures and give it more weight. Also, on the other hand, it might not always be effective, right? So you might also want to take a gradual approach, and it's something that we have been, with the revision of the cyber diplomacy toolbox, looking into more closely how we can, as EU, put more a gradual approach on the table, more sustained, a more coherent approach, using the full range of the tools that the EU has at its disposal, and also tailor that more to the actor or the situation in hand, depending on the objective again in mind. So if you want to influence the behavior of the perpetrator, deter him, discourage him, that has a different purpose, and you might use different instruments that if you want to focus on raising awareness or promoting the UN framework. So we've, with the revision of the toolbox, incorporated the role of attribution more within the toolbox, and at the same time elaborated a bit more on the different objectives that the work of the toolbox, and attribution in particular, can have within promoting peace and security, where again attribution plays a role, but is not equal in this sense to accountability. So.
Thank you very much, Mano, especially for highlighting that there are indeed different narratives or different follow-ups to attribution, and different states at different points in time might lean on attribution findings to increase security and defense through different vectors. And Romain, if I could turn over to you on this specific point to get Ukraine's perspective into the conversation. How do you see attribution as a tool? You don't need to compare it to the elements of the cyber diplomacy toolbox, but rather really for Ukraine's specific threat environment that it encounters, especially in this conflict environment it is currently going through. I think it might be very interesting for our audience as well to see how this wartime circumstance now might have changed the calculus of Ukrainian decision-making on public attribution.
Oh, thank you. I would like to reflect to what my colleague said first, because in terms of attribution of the malicious actors, there is a feeling. You've probably seen that any news or tweets or posts about the malicious attacks are illustrated by the guy folks mask or the guy in a hoodie. And we all believe that we can tear down those masks, tear down those hoodie, see who are there, and take them down to responsibility and deter in a way they will not doing that. But let me be the devil's advocate in this approach. Russia is not the country that understands deterrence as we see clearly and we feel clearly. And there is no problem in attribution of the key malicious actors. President Putin, one, the head of FSB, Federal Security Service, the head of GRU, main intelligence directorate, or the head of SVR, Foreign Intelligence Service. They all are attributed. We all know that they are behind the key attacks, and it's approved by our reports, Microsoft reports, international community. We know that. And the backside of this approach of taking down them to responsibility is that because Russia doesn't believe in rules, and if we impose the rules, we Europeans will be the only who will be obliged to follow the rules. We got the same stuff, the same problem in the communication when we believe in the fair news and two sides and two ideas, and Russians don't believe that, and they use that against Europe. They use that against Ukraine, Poland, and all the countries in the European Union. So it's not. It's very important to remember those problems of attribution in the future. When we see attribution at this particular moment, and we discuss that with my colleagues who work with the cybersecurity issues, we see that as a tool to create a better resilience. Because for us, attribution is understanding who is behind the attack. We do know that all those malicious actors we've just mentioned from different branches of Russia and their contributors and freelancers, commonly called as hacktivists, but we know they are not. They are learning fast, but they are in a way very, we know their patterns, we know their habits. We can attribute them by the means they use, by the types of attack they use, and stuff like this. The most recent example of that is the yesterday's event when Ukraine's CERT-UA team found out very big attack by APT28 that were targeting free mail servers, and we know those groups. We know what they're doing, and we know the vulnerability they exploit, and we know how to talk with other organizations with the same vulnerability. Be prepared. Those group is active, so we use attribution to create resilience. And the key problem here, if not the problem, but the issue we can tackle, it's a trust between us. It's exactly what my colleague said about the information sharing, about the threat intelligence sharing. The more we know in general, the better we prepare, the better resilience we have. Just as our colleague at the beginning, the keynote speaker, said about the need of the resilience, this is exactly what we need about the resilience. Threat intelligence sharing to understand what's going on and to share between the civilians. Because in Ukraine, we do have amount of cyber attacks tripled in the last year during the war, and 75% of them was on the civilian infrastructure. A big part is on the critical infrastructure. So building trust between us, building trust between different organizations, shared knowledge is the key for attribution that we see as a tool for the resilience, not only to tear down the mask of the guy folks and stuff like this. Yes, this should be done after but we believe that it should be done after the win of the war and after taking down to responsibility those responsible for illegal war, and then we can talk about the responsibility afterwards.
Thank you, Roman, for bringing in this operational dimension of attribution and also speaking to the sequencing of attribution by different actors and for different purposes. And when we talk about this operational facet, you highlighted that continuity is important for resilience, this continuous exchange of threat intelligence as quickly as possible to warn and strengthen targets before they actually come into reach of some of the threat actors and their new tools and tactics that are identified. When we take these considerations to the legal dimension, one might replace these resilience considerations with questions of coherence. So is there some sort of path dependency that is developing once state actors decide to attribute certain kinds of activity to continue to do so for any future cases that enter the public domain? Johanna, could you put that into perspective for us?
Thank you, Jakob. It's working. It's a great opportunity to be here. Thank you. It's an insightful question. I'll try to respond the best I can. Whereas taking into account all the observations that my co-panelists have shared previously, now, I do believe international law does have a good answer to the question that you posed. With your kind permission, I'm going to try and unpack a few things, and then you let me know if that's an answer to the question that you posed. We seem to have combined at least 3 legal regimes here. We've talked about responsibility of states, and that's probably the regime that's most directly applicable here. I would view the cyber diplomacy toolbox as a direct application of the state responsibility regime. That is the regime that allows to attribute an active state being an active performance or an omission that is in violation of international law. And that has been the thinking of the European Union for almost a decade now. We identify a breach of international law, and we are trying to attribute it to a specific state. Now, this is not always easy because states cannot be attributed with acts of individuals acting on their own, so to speak. So the most recent examples that you have kindly mentioned would probably fall into the criminal international law regime with the Rome statute and the proceedings against Mr. Putin that seem to be unfolding. But that's a bit of a different regime. You would then be looking at criminal responsibility of individuals, whereas the cyber diplomacy toolbox is derived from state responsibility. So we would be looking at a state controlling or ordering a certain activity to be performed. And I do agree it's challenging to attribute an APT to Mr. Putin, for example. It would be challenging for us to show evidence that it is indeed him who ordered a cyber attack. But the law on state responsibility allows us to attribute also omissions. So if we're able to show that he did not prevent that harmful activity, that interference with state sovereignty from happening, we could be still able to, for example, impose sanctions. And that's something that the EU has been doing relatively effectively. With that, I'm trying to say that these examples that my colleagues have shared show how international law can be used as a tool to incite positive behavior, or at least to call out those members of the international community who misbehave. And that, I believe, is also to address Patrick's point that EU likes to point fingers, whereas themselves they struggle with acting in a manner that is compliant with international law. I think that is partially true, but also if we were to look at good practice examples, you would have to agree, Patrick, that we have the brilliant GDPR, we have the brilliant NIS, and now we have NIS 2. So we have this comprehensive framework that is supposed to show how a good state, a good actor, among the like-minded countries would behave on the international arena. And last but not least, Europe has always been a spokesperson, a spokes-country, a spokes-actor for human rights. And that is a component that no other actor on the international arena can pride themselves on using as explicitly as the EU has, with the GDPR being a paradigm example of EU being the universal regulator, if you will. So in that sense, I would say that international law offers us at least 3 tools. That's state responsibility, that's probably individual criminal responsibility, although that would be more challenging for cyber attacks or cyber actions because the Rome statute is relatively narrow. And then there's also a regime of international liability. Now in Europe, we seem to be more inclined to recognize it. We want states to prevent harmful activities in cyberspace, whereas other, even like-minded countries might struggle with that concept, saying, well, it's too difficult, we're too big, we're too under too big of a threat, so we are not willing to see that due diligence cybersecurity standard as applicable. With the cyber diplomacy toolbox, we are setting an international precedent with the cyber sanctions, where we are able to point out to specific individuals using the cyber sanctions regime and to model good behavior in cyberspace. I can already see that there are replies from my co-panelists. I'm going to stop here, but I have more controversial content whenever needed. Thank you.
Thank you, Johanna, for making my job as a moderator so much easier. I don't even need to ask questions anymore. So without further ado, Roman, you have immediate direct reaction, I believe.
No, I was just going to come up with a fictional process, which I believe is very close to the real process, just to show how hard it is to use the legislation in the rules when you talk with Russia, because Russia's approach is to blur the lines. When you do have a legislation in the rules, what would you do with the process when Mr. Putin whispers to the guy, then the guy whispers to the guy, then the guy whispers to the guy who's sitting on the pile of cash laundered by the Nord Stream 2, and it's very clearly is there and it's impossible to get or circumvented through other. And then there is a direct order to launch an attack on the Telegram channel. Nothing out of this is not clearly under the international law, and that's one of the biggest challenges in the attribution. Again, those chain of command, whisper, guy on the pile of cash from the 9th Street 2 is a fictional, but I believe it's very close to the reality how it operates in Russian Federation.
Yeah, just to follow up very quickly on this, when we talk about, and just to be clear, when we talk about attribution in the international law context and international relations, we don't necessarily talk about attributing to Mr. Putin. We talk about attributing to Russia. So that link is much easier to be made, and we do not really have to point the whole cycle of how Putin may be or not giving the orders. We actually have to establish that link to Russia in order to rely on international law, which has been done and is done regularly. But I would like to clarify, and this is why I wanted to take floor, one thing that Joanna has assigned as, if I said it, but I did not say that the EU is violating international law. No. I said that it sets the standards and keeps maybe others up to different standards than itself. But I think Roman's point as well, speaks almost to how we have, to some extent, fetishized the idea of attribution as everything that links to anything in cyberspace. So if I were to put a controversial idea on the table, to follow also my co-panelists, I would say, why are we going for a very high standard of attribution where we want to be 99% sure that the connection we're making is plausible? Why not actually to go in the opposite direction, and rather than making attribution something that is done really very scarcely, to make it something that's a common practice? And I think there are really good reasons to do that. A lot of attribution that is already being made by the EU or the member states actually hardly ever points a finger at a specific country. Most of the time, it is done mentioning the attacks originating from the territory of a specific country. So it is sort of indirect, let's say, pointing finger, but still everybody tries to stay away from directly naming who is behind the attack. So that sort of leaves us in this gray zone of, yes, we actually cannot really act on behalf, using international law as a base, because we have not made very clear attribution, but at the same time, we would like to do something. Now, if we lower the standard and we actually start calling out the violation of norms, so one of the UN norms that everybody has agreed to is that states should not knowingly allow the attacks against other countries originate from their territory. Now, if you look at the any sort of a threat assessment, you will see that actually the attacks in cyberspace are originating not only from 5 countries that we like to talk about, but actually from any country or every country around the world, right? It is sort of quite common that different states' territory is being used to launch attacks against others. Now, why not to use the practice of calling out those attacks and attributing them, like we do right now, not to a country, but to a territory of a country. Would that make the norm that we are talking about much more stronger? I believe it might. I'm thinking aloud here, so I'm hoping that some people will disagree. But at the same time, it might also give us an indication of what else can be done if we talk about accountability. If I want to attribute or issue a statement that attributes an attack originating from the territory of Ghana and want to issue that statement as a high representative of the EU, I might as well use the same statement not to blame and shame Ghanaian government, but actually to offer the support and help through cyber capacity building or other efforts in order to remedy the situation. That would actually hit two birds with one stone. One, it would basically tick off the box of validating the norm as agreed as the UN level, but at the same time would go in the direction of strengthening the principle of due diligence and actually making sure that states cannot hide behind it as something that really allows them to sort of perpetrate the violations of norms. So I'll stop here.
Thank you, Patrick. And if I can tag one additional consideration to your point just now on what Acquis of Norms already says about how states should be responding to malicious cyber activity that is tied to their territory. Norms are one point of reference, but there's also potentially another yardstick. Earlier this month, we had the FSB claiming that US intelligence services had used software vulnerabilities they said were provided by Apple to compromise iPhones in Russia, including devices purportedly registered by foreign diplomatic missions in Russia, including those of NATO member states. And I should say that Apple outright denied these allegations, and Russian authorities, a little surprisingly, have not published any further substantiations of these accusations. But is that also another consideration that needs to enter our view, that it's not just the like-minded camp that is attributing, but every now and then you also see authoritarian regimes getting into the game, and that becomes a point of comparison, and there we want to make sure that we have clear markers on due process in place that distinguishes our attribution statements. Is that also something that you think is already reflected in how within the like-minded group of states we are approaching attribution? Is this something we need to pay more attention to?
So I don't want to monopolize the discussion, so I'll be quick, and maybe Manon also has some reflections from within the like-minded group conversations, but I think actually it is not a bad development that authoritarian regimes like China, Russia, and others actually start referring and do sort of attribution in their own, following their own procedures. And I don't think it's a bad thing because, again, it strengthens another norm that has been established at the UN, which is that states should take into consideration all circumstances when attributing. And actually, that was one of the norms, of one of a few norms on which actually Russians have engaged within different discussions at the UN. So I would say, yes, let them attribute, but let them also tell us how they go about this, because so far all the standards that have been put on the table and the procedures have come from, as you have called it, a like-minded Western camp, and we knew very little on how Russia and China are going around their own procedures. So if we want to really strengthen the process, not only from our own perspective, but make it more credible to the rest of the world, because let's not forget, you know, we're talking about the group 40, 50 countries that are part of the Western like-minded bloc, then you have a few that are maybe authoritarian regimes, but there is a very large majority of countries in the world, in the global south, as it's commonly referred to, that actually do not like the practice of attribution exactly being feared of what some big partners like China might be saying. So sort of making this practice much more common, again, would sort of remove this myth of attribution as being something that automatically puts you on the radar screen of everybody else, but rather something that becomes a common practice. And then we can have a conversation about the standards.
Manon, I see you nodding. Anything you'd like to add to this?
No, I completely agree with Patrick that the more conversation we have about accountability and attribution, again, is an instrument in this context, the more we actually promote the United Nations framework for responsible state behavior, which basically enhances peace and security in cyberspace. So I think that the discussion broadens is a good thing. Indeed, transparency and predictability about how this is conducted, taking into account certain procedures, taking into account also their own need for credibility in this context is of use. But the discussion in any case, and I wanted to pick up also the points made by the colleague from Ukraine, is that the information and the knowledge about malicious cyber activities by increasingly and structurally monitoring the threat landscape, raising awareness about the threat landscape, what is happening, also repositories which have been established like the Cyber Peace Institute or other initiatives in this context, cooperation, increased cooperation with private sector, but also exchanging this data with partners and also being transparent about it, communicating as far as possible when coming out and calling out malicious cyber activities is important, because actually it puts this issue of accountability in the first instance, and where necessary attribution at the forefront of the discussion, which helps us to strengthen the United Nations framework. So we very much see this in the context of setting this norm, and the more discussion about what is the norm and how is that norm applicable, as also how international law applies, can only contribute to more peace and security in cyberspace.
Thank you very much, Mano. I would have loved to follow this with a question more specifically on the role of the private sector. We are at the same time rapidly running out of time. So I would like to take advantage of having Joanna on the panel with us to circle back to some perhaps guiding points that international law can offer us for what makes a robust framework for attribution. Is there anything we can derive in terms of best practices by the standards that international law is setting that can help us have an open discussion about what needs to be part of public attribution statements by government, so that we have sort of a common blueprint that states can turn to?
Great. Thank you. Just very briefly, I am aware of the time as well. Yes, just very briefly. I am aware that attribution always has been and will remain political, but international law does give us a toolbox to regulate that political debate. What Europe has been doing, as I've already mentioned, for at least a decade now, was setting a good practice example. And I agree with what Patrick and Manon, that other actors chiming into this discussion and using, if you will, our arguments against us is a good sign, because we're having a universal conversation on the framework. Now, the UN framework on responsible state behavior is that paradigm we are looking to achieve. And that framework is based on the contemporary understanding of international law, its contemporary sources, including state responsibility and my favorite, due diligence. Thank you, Patrick, for mentioning that. We've struggled with attributing individual actions to states, not just in the cyber context. We've had the Blackwater affair. We've had private military companies. These issues have always been there as long as there has been international conflict, most recently with the little green man in Ukraine who've been occupying a territory officially not navigated, guided, ordered by the state. So these issues have always persisted, but the evolution of international law and its application appropriate to the contemporary challenges helps us to resolve that dispute universally. And indeed, adopting the UN framework will help us move that discussion forward. That's the short answer, and we can continue off the record afterwards. Thank you.
No, but right to the point, and thank you also for highlighting that these discussions never only take place within a cyber context. There are a lot of lessons to be learned from other areas of application. To close us out, Roman and Patrick, if I could ask you to take us out of this conversation with your perspectives on a forward-looking question. Attribution often is also about who has a voice, and Ukraine's voice has been very instrumental in the last few years about detecting cyber activity and sending early warning signals also to partner companies and partner organizations. But it's also important that we think about how this process can be further democratized to make sure that it is not only European and Five Eyes countries and their threat perspectives that are represented in these discussions. I have a sort of, sub-question to this that I'll throw over to you, Patrick. Is there a need to integrate attribution best practices into external capacity building more actively to make attribution more inclusive?
So for me, it depends, again, on what's the standard. If the standard is the high-level standard that we've applying so far, that you attribute in order to call out the malicious behavior of the state and impose some sort of sanction, not necessarily sanctions as the EU has been applying it, I don't think the capacity building is going to help, because 99% of countries do not really have the technical capacity to attribute and will always rely on foreign intelligence. However, if we want to use this attribution to enforce certain norms, like not allowing this territory to be used for malicious attacks, then I think you can lower the standard and attribute, and in that case, you'll only need to, you can rely on your own intelligence, your certs, and so on. And that, of course, would make much more sense. But before I hand you over the microphone, I just want to go back to one point that Roman made, which I think is extremely important, and for me, something I'll be taking away from this panel, which is how you have connected attribution with resilience and strengthening resilience. Actually, 99% of people probably in the panel, on the panel and in the audience would expect you actually to talk about attribution and the need to impose consequences and punish those who are performing the attacks. But you have linked it to resilience, which I agree with you is really the important element that ultimately really sort of allows us to grow together and then push away the risk of conflicts in cyberspace. So I would really like to acknowledge the fact that I very much like that point that you make, and that's definitely something that we should be really thinking much more about, rather than think of attribution and linking it immediately to the idea of punishment and imposing sanctions.
The clapping.
Yes. Just final words, Roman.
You don't hear me clapping, but I'm echoing the words.
Just two final words. This idea is not mine. It's exactly the result of the discussion within the team, within the specialists. We come up with the idea. This is exactly what we have to do all together with different countries. And one last point. There is a well-known book by Lou Cicine, A Dark Forest. And the idea of the dark forest is that any civilization can survive only by eliminating others. It's a handbook by the Russian Federation at this particular moment. And they believe in that as far as we know and as far as we see every night with the rockets and stuff. And I'm just trying to point out that that's the approach of Russian Federation. And when we talk about legislation, let's remember that they do use international legislation as a weak point in their crusade against the dark forest. So we have to win the war and then talk about the international legislation and new rules.
Powerful words to close us out. Thank you so much to all our panelists. Thank you so much to you, Manon, for joining us remotely. I would invite the audience to extend that thank you with a great round of applause for our panelists. Thank you so much.